At 80 years old, Marguerite Calls had nothing left to her name but a canvas sack of clothes and $11 folded into a handkerchief, and the county had just finished nailing a foreclosure notice to the door of the only home she had known for 40 years. Her nephew Weldon Calls, the last living relative willing to even answer her letters, had made it plain there was no room in his house for an aging widow who could no longer pay her way, and so she had ridden the mail wagon as far as its route allowed and walked the rest into the town of Cutter's Ridge with nothing but that handkerchief of coins and a lifetime of quiet knowing folded inside her. It was there, behind a defunct freight depot, that she spent every last dollar she had, 9 of the 11, on a rusted long-abandoned storage unit the depot's owner had forgotten even existed, sold to her as a joke more than a transaction, a windowless steel box nobody expected to hold anything but dust and rat bones. She did not know, as she worked the frozen padlock loose with a borrowed pry bar, that sealed inside that forgotten unit was a secret buried decades before, one that would not only give her back the life that had been stripped from her, but would settle an old and bitter debt the whole town of Cutter's Ridge had long since stopped believing could ever be paid. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Marguerite Calls. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten, we hope this story reminds you that being overlooked is never the same as being without worth. Tell us in the comments about a time you found value in something everyone else had already written off. Marguerite had been born Marguerite Ashworth in 1846 in the river town of Millhaven, the eldest of 4 children raised by a father who worked as a freight clerk for the rail line that ran goods down to the coast, and a mother who took in bookkeeping work for half the merchants in town. A skill considered unusual for a woman of that era but tolerated because Cora Ashworth's ledgers were simply more accurate than any man's in the county. It was from her mother that Marguerite learned the discipline that would define her entire life: the reading of records. Cora believed that numbers, unlike people, never lied outright, though they could certainly be made to lie by omission, by a missing entry, by a column that did not sum the way it ought to. And she taught her daughter to read a ledger the way another mother might teach a daughter to read scripture, with patience, with suspicion of anything too neat, and with the understanding that the truth of a business, a family, or a town was usually hiding in the smallest, most overlooked figures rather than the grand totals everyone was content to glance at and accept. Her father, Samuel Ashworth, gave her a different gift, one born of decades spent inside freight depots and rail yards. An intimate, almost reverent understanding of how goods moved, how they were stored, how they were hidden, and how honest men and dishonest men alike used the same crates and the same shadowed corners of a depot to keep their business private. He would take young Marguerite with him on slow Sundays when the yard was quiet, showing her how a false bottom could be built into a shipping crate without altering its outer dimensions, how a careful eye could spot a seam in wood that did not belong, how the weight of a crate sometimes told a truer story than its manifest did. He never explained precisely why a freight clerk needed to know such things, only that a man who understood how things were hidden could never be easily fooled by those who wished to hide something from him, and Marguerite absorbed this instruction as thoroughly as she absorbed her mother's ledgers, though she would not understand, for another 6 decades, just how completely these 2 inherited skills would one day converge to save her. Millhaven's prosperity depended on the rail line, and it was through that same rail line that Marguerite met Harlan Calls, a soft-spoken freight inspector who traveled the route checking cargo manifests against actual loads, a man whose quiet thoroughness matched something essential in her own nature. They married in 1867, when Marguerite was 21, and settled in the modest township of Bracken Falls, further inland, where Harlan eventually left the rail line to open a small dry goods store while Marguerite kept their household, and in time gave birth to their only child, a son named Everett, born in 1870. Bracken Falls was a town built on modest, honest commerce, and the Calls family found in it a steady, unremarkable happiness. Harlan minding his store with the same careful eye he had once brought to freight manifests, Marguerite keeping the family's books with a precision that made the little store more profitable than its size would have suggested, and Everett growing into a bright, restless boy who showed early signs of his father's careful nature, though as he grew into manhood, that carefulness curdled, slowly and without any single dramatic turn, into something closer to caution about appearances, about status, about what the neighbors might think, a difference in temperament that would matter far more than Marguerite could have guessed in those early, contented years. Harlan died in 1901, of a weakened heart that gave out one autumn evening while he was closing the store's ledger for the night, and Marguerite found herself at 55, a widow managing a small business that had always depended as much on Harlan's steady presence behind the counter as on her own bookkeeping. She managed for a decade reasonably well, keeping the store afloat through careful economy and the goodwill of long-time customers, but by the time she reached her late 60s her hands had grown less steady, her eyesight less reliable for fine print, and the store's profits thinned year over year until Everett, now a respected bank clerk in the larger town of Cutter's Ridge and increasingly concerned with his own standing in that community, began to press his mother to sell the store and come live under his roof where, he assured her, she would want for nothing. Marguerite sold the dry goods store in the spring of 1924, at Everett's urging, believing his intentions came from genuine filial concern, and moved into a small room in his household in Cutter's Ridge, where his wife Adeline ran a home known for its tidy propriety and where Everett had, in the years since his father's death, cultivated an image of respectable prosperity he guarded carefully. It became clear within months that Marguerite's presence complicated that image in ways Everett found increasingly difficult to tolerate, for she was, in his eyes, a visible reminder of humbler origins, an aging woman with rough hands and old-fashioned habits who did not fit neatly into the polished parlor where Everett entertained bank colleagues and town officials, and the small slights accumulated with a quiet cruelty that never once announced itself outright. Meals served to her separately. When guests came, her chair moved to a corner when photographs were taken. Her old bookkeeping skills dismissed as a relic no longer needed now that Everett managed his own money through the bank's modern systems. The end came in the winter of 1926, when Everett, facing a difficult vote for a position on the town council that required, in his calculation, an impression of a clean, modern, prosperous household, informed his mother with careful, rehearsed regret that it would be better for everyone if she found other lodging, that a small stipend could be arranged, that surely a woman of her resourcefulness could manage on her own for a time until his position was more secure. Marguerite listened to her son's careful phrases without argument, understanding in that moment, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful after months of quiet humiliation, that she had become in his eyes precisely what she had feared, an inconvenient reminder rather than a mother to be honored. She took the $11 that remained of the stipend he offered, packed a canvas sack with what clothing and small keepsakes she could carry, and left his house before dawn the following morning, telling Adeline only that she did not wish to be a burden any longer to a household that had made its priorities plain. She walked the length of Cutter's Ridge that first day with no particular destination, an old woman with a canvas sack drawing curious, pitying glances from townsfolk who did not know her circumstances, until exhaustion brought her to rest behind the town's old freight depot, a building that had stood mostly disused since the rail line rerouted through a larger junction some 15 miles distant, leaving Cutter's Ridge with only a scattering of forgotten storage units. The depot's owner, a weary, overworked man named Rufus Dean, had long since stopped bothering to properly catalogue. It was Rufus who found her resting there, and who, taking pity on an old woman with nowhere to go but recognizing in her exhausted, dignified bearing something that made him reluctant to simply turn her away, mentioned almost as an afterthought that there was one storage unit at the depot's far end, Unit Number 14, that had sat locked and unclaimed for as long as he could remember, its rent unpaid for over 20 years, and that if she had $9 to spare, the county would happily transfer whatever claim it held on the abandoned contents to whoever wanted the trouble of hauling them out. Marguerite understood, even as she counted out 9 of her 11 remaining dollars into Rufus Dean's calloused hand, that she was making a decision most sensible people would have called foolish, spending nearly everything she had left on a padlocked steel box she had not even seen the inside of. But something in her, some old instinct her father had planted decades before in the freight yards of Millhaven, told her that an unclaimed unit sitting untouched for 20 years in a depot built for honest commerce was a puzzle worth the risk of her last few dollars, and she signed the transfer papers Rufus produced with a hand that had not lost, even after decades of hardship, its old bookkeeper's steadiness. The padlock on Unit 14 had rusted so thoroughly into itself that it took Marguerite the better part of an hour, working with a pry bar Rufus lent her out of what she suspected was equal parts curiosity and pity, to finally force it open. And when the corrugated steel door finally screeched upward on its ancient track, the space that greeted her was dim, close, and thick with a particular staleness of air that had not moved freely in a very long time, revealing a modest jumble of crates and a single steamer trunk pushed against the far wall, all of it coated in 2 decades of undisturbed dust. Her first pass through the unit's contents yielded little beyond disappointment: a scattering of moth-eaten linens, a few pieces of cracked crockery, tools too rusted for any practical use, the ordinary detritus of some forgotten household or business that had simply stopped paying its storage fees and never returned. And Marguerite felt, for the first time since leaving her son's house, the full weight of her own desperation settle over her as she realized she had likely spent nearly the last of her money on nothing more than someone else's forgotten rubbish. It was the steamer trunk that gave her pause, for even beneath its coating of dust, Marguerite's eye, trained by decades of her father's old lessons about the weight and construction of storage containers, noticed something faintly irregular about its proportions: a trunk that appeared from the outside somewhat deeper than the space its interior seemed to occupy when she finally worked its stiff latches open, and found only a modest collection of old ledgers and account books inside, resting atop what looked at first glance like the trunk's ordinary wooden floor. She might have dismissed the discrepancy entirely, exhausted as she was, had her father's old voice not surfaced in her memory with startling clarity. His patient insistence, decades before, that a man who understood how things were hidden could never be easily fooled by those who wished to hide something from him. And so she lifted the ledgers out one by one, setting them carefully aside, and began running her fingers along the trunk's interior seams with the same deliberate patience her mother had once brought to a column of figures that refused to sum correctly. What she found, after nearly 20 minutes of careful searching, was a nearly invisible seam along the trunk's false floor, cleverly fitted to sit flush against the true bottom panel below it, and when she finally worked it loose with the edge of the pry bar, she discovered beneath it a shallow compartment containing a bundle of documents wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved them remarkably well against the passing decades, along with a small drawstring pouch of gold coins that made her breath catch sharply in the dim, dusty air of the storage unit. But it was the documents themselves, once she carried them out into the fading daylight and began carefully unwrapping the oilcloth, that would prove to matter far more than the coins, for what she found inside was a set of meticulously kept ledgers and a lengthy handwritten account, both belonging to a man whose name she recognized instantly from her years of quiet observation in Cutter's Ridge: Josiah Dean, Rufus's own late grandfather, who had once, decades before, served as the town's freight agent and, according to the careful figures recorded in his own hand, had also served for many years as the secret, silent bookkeeper for a cooperative fund the town's founding families had established to hold in common trust the profits from the region's original timber rights, a fund that had, according to Josiah's final entries, been quietly and fraudulently drained by a rival faction of town leaders in the final years before his sudden death, its remaining assets falsely recorded as lost or spent when in truth they had simply been redirected into private accounts controlled by men whose descendants still held considerable influence over Cutter's Ridge to that very day. Marguerite spent the better part of a week in a small rented room above Rufus Dean's own modest lodgings, for he had offered her shelter once he understood something of what she had found in his family's forgotten unit, poring over Josiah Dean's careful ledgers with the same patient scrutiny her mother had taught her decades before in Millhaven, cross-referencing dates and figures and names until a clear and damning picture emerged. The Cooperative Timber Fund, established in 1889 by a coalition of Cutter's Ridge's founding families to ensure that profits from the town's shared timber rights would benefit the community broadly rather than any single family, had by 1904 accumulated a substantial sum, only to be systematically drained over the following 3 years by a small group of trustees led by a banker named Thaddeus Wren, who had falsified the fund's records to show declining timber prices and mounting expenses that never in fact occurred, quietly funneling the difference into his own family's holdings before Josiah Dean, discovering the fraud through his own careful bookkeeping, was found dead of what the town had recorded as a sudden apoplexy, though his final ledger entries, written in a hand growing visibly agitated across the last pages, suggested he had intended to expose the theft before his death intervened. She understood, reading these documents by lamplight in Rufus's spare room, that what she held was not merely an old grievance but a live and provable claim. For the timber rights the original cooperative fund had been built upon continued to generate income to that very day. Income that for over 2 decades had flowed almost entirely into the hands of the Wren family and its banking interests rather than being shared, as originally intended, among the town's founding families and, by extension, the broader community whose shared labor had established those rights in the first place. She did not act rashly, for her father's old lessons about honest observation had taught her that a claim of such magnitude, brought against a family as entrenched as the Wrens, whose current patriarch, council candidate Everett Calls's own banking colleague and mentor, a cold, precise man named Corliss Wren, now controlled the very bank where her own son worked, would require evidence far more substantial than an old man's private ledgers to prove in any court willing to hear it. Marguerite brought her discovery, cautiously and deliberately, to a semi-retired county surveyor and former notary named Ambrose Tilden, an elderly widower who had once handled much of the original paperwork establishing the cooperative timber rights decades before, and who possessed both a reputation for scrupulous honesty and, she learned through careful inquiry, a long-standing personal resentment toward the Wren family stemming from a land dispute the bank had handled against him years before. With what he considered deliberate unfairness. Ambrose received her account with initial wariness, an old woman with a canvas sack and a story of decades-old fraud being an unlikely herald of justice, but as she laid Josiah Dean's ledgers before him and walked him through the figures with the same patient precision her mother had once brought to a merchant's disputed accounts, his skepticism gave way to a mounting, absorbed recognition of what the documents represented. For he alone in Cutter's Ridge still possessed independent copies of the original 1889 cooperative agreement, filed decades before under the county's older recording system and never fully reconciled with the Wren family's later, altered version of events. It was Ambrose who explained to Marguerite the delicate reality of pursuing such a claim, that Josiah Dean's private ledgers, however damning, would need to be corroborated by the original cooperative agreement and by some independent verification that the timber income the Wrens currently controlled did in fact derive from the disputed common fund rather than from land the family had legitimately acquired through other means, and he warned her that Corliss Wren, a man who had spent 30 years cultivating unassailable respectability in Cutter's Ridge, would resist any such exposure with every resource his considerable banking influence afforded him. That resistance arrived within days of Marguerite's quiet inquiries reaching the wrong ears, in the person of her own son Everett, who appeared at Rufus Dean's door one evening not out of any renewed filial concern but at the visible urging of his employer and mentor, informing his mother with barely concealed agitation that whatever old papers she believed she had found were surely mistaken, that stirring up such old and unfounded accusations against a man of Corliss Wren's standing could only bring humiliation upon herself and, he added with a coldness that struck her more deeply than any insult he had offered in his own household, upon the family name she still, however undeservedly, shared with him. In the weeks that followed, Marguerite and Ambrose found themselves navigating a quiet, escalating campaign of pressure that Corliss Wren orchestrated through the practiced subtlety of a man long accustomed to managing local opposition without ever appearing to lift a finger himself. Rufus Dean, whose modest depot business depended in part on freight contracts the Wren Bank had influence over, found himself abruptly informed that certain arrangements might need reconsidering unless he distanced himself from his lodger's troublesome inquiries, a pressure he bore with more quiet courage than Marguerite had dared hope for, refusing to withdraw his support even as his own livelihood grew uncertain. Ambrose Tilden's request to formally examine the county's original land recording ledgers, kept in a dusty annex of the courthouse, was abruptly denied by a records clerk who cited an irregular scheduling conflict that Ambrose suspected, though could not immediately prove, had been arranged through the same quiet influence pressing on Rufus. Undeterred, Marguerite and Ambrose pursued a different avenue, traveling together by wagon to the state land office in the county seat, where after considerable searching through poorly indexed decades-old filings, Ambrose located an original, uncorrupted copy of the 1889 cooperative agreement, preserved only because it had been filed under an early, informal name the Timber Cooperative had used before its later incorporation, a filing quirk that had allowed it to escape whatever quiet alterations had been made to the more commonly referenced county records over the intervening decades. Cross-referenced meticulously against Josiah Dean's ledger entries, the original agreement provided exactly the independent corroboration their claim required, establishing beyond reasonable dispute that the timber income currently flowing into Wren family holdings had never legitimately belonged to any single family at all, but to the town's founding cooperative and, through it, to Cutter's Ridge as a whole. Armed with this evidence, Ambrose brought the matter first before the town council, whose upcoming election Everett Calls had hoped to win with Corliss Wren's backing, and then, when the council proved reluctant to act against its most powerful banking family, before a circuit judge in the county seat, presenting a case that drew swift and considerable attention once word spread that the respected Wren banking fortune had been built, in substantial part, upon a fraud perpetrated against the town's own founding families decades before. Corliss Wren, through a team of attorneys assembled with the full weight of his banking resources, fought the claim bitterly, questioning the authenticity of ledgers found in a forgotten storage unit and the reliability of an elderly, penniless widow's testimony. But the original cooperative agreement, verified independently at the state land office, and Josiah Dean's meticulous decades-old bookkeeping proved impossible for even Wren's considerable influence to fully suppress, particularly once Rufus Dean, drawing on his own grandfather's memory, testified plainly to the family history he had always understood but never before had cause to publicly declare. The circuit court's ruling, delivered in the early spring of 1927 after months of proceedings that had transformed Marguerite Calls from an unknown, destitute newcomer into perhaps the most quietly discussed figure in Cutter's Ridge's recent memory, found decisively that the timber income had indeed been fraudulently diverted from the cooperative fund decades before, and ordered a substantial restitution to be paid from Wren family holdings into a restored community trust, along with an ongoing share of future timber income to benefit the town broadly, precisely as the original 1889 founders had intended. Corliss Wren, standing in Cutter's Ridge, and with it his banking influence, did not survive the public reckoning that followed, and Everett Calls, whose council candidacy collapsed entirely under the weight of his mentor's disgrace and his own visible complicity in trying to suppress his mother's claim, found himself, in a quiet irony Marguerite took no satisfaction in but also did not mourn, facing precisely the kind of diminished standing he had once feared she would bring upon him. Marguerite did not seek personal enrichment from the restitution beyond a modest sum the grateful, restored community trust insisted she accept, a sum she used to secure a small, comfortable room above Rufus Dean's depot rather than pursuing any grander claim her discovery might have entitled her to make. The bulk of the restitution, at her own quiet insistence, was directed toward establishing a permanent fund to assist elderly residents of Cutter's Ridge who, like she herself had so nearly become, found themselves without family support in their later years, a provision she pressed for with the same immovable determination her mother had once brought to a disputed ledger, understanding better than anyone in that town what it meant to be treated as an inconvenience rather than a person of worth. We began this story with an 80-year-old woman who had nothing left to her name but $11 and a canvas sack, cast aside by the one son who should have honored her, spending nearly everything she had on a forgotten steel box behind a freight depot that everyone else in town had long since dismissed as worthless. It is worth returning now to that image, because it holds within it the whole of what Marguerite Calls's life had prepared her to understand and what she, in the end, restored not only to herself but to an entire town that had forgotten its own founding promise. She had been raised by a mother who taught her that truth hides in overlooked figures, and by a father who taught her that anything can be hidden by someone determined enough to hide it, and that only patient, honest attention can ever bring such things back into the light. Her son had believed her age and her poverty made her a burden, a woman whose usefulness had ended. But Marguerite had spent 80 years learning that worth is rarely visible on the surface of things, not in an abandoned storage unit, not in an elderly widow others had already dismissed, and not in a set of old ledgers sealed away in darkness for over 20 patient years. The storage unit did not make Marguerite Calls valuable. It simply gave the town of Cutter's Ridge, at long last, the chance to see what had been true of her all along. Thank you for spending this time with us tonight and for walking alongside Marguerite through the whole of her story. If her quiet resolve moved you, we hope you will share this with someone who might need reminding that being counted out by others is never the same as being without worth. Before you go, we would love to know, what is a time in your own life when you found real value in something or someone that everyone else had already written off as finished? We read every story you leave for us in the comments, and each one reminds us why we tell these stories in the first place. Until next time, stay close.